before talking about training suggestions, you gotta look at what might be the case here, like what's the reason they're not performing well versus these tests that they're doing. My first thought is that, say they're a 100-meter sprinter, are they testing 100 meter in training, or is it a 30 meter, is it a 20 meter where they accelerate well? They said their short approach is good. Do they accelerate well? They're explosive out of the start, but speed endurance is lacking, so they don't finish well. They don't reach top speed and maintain, or maybe that's one issue for the 100 specifically. And I guess the other thing to think about is when it comes meet day, is psychological, is that a factor where they're just psyching themselves out? They're tensing up. They're not running well on meet day, specific to the events they're running.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think being a gamer, in the sense that you show up and you perform really well is obviously really important. But I think another component of this is how well do your testing measures correlate with your actual performance. So, for example, if you are a 100-meter dash guy, I've heard Dan Paff or Mike, I've heard you reference it before, that overhead backs correlate with 100-meter performance or something like that. But that, in my opinion, they might not be that similar. Even though there might be a correlation, there still might be components to that make it vastly different. So running 100, yeah, you display high power over short periods of time, but it's still not an overhead back. So there are a lot of scenarios where the test that you're doing to see if you're getting better isn't actually the performance you're trying to do. So for example, bounding for a 100-meter dash runner. Bounding is not sprinting. I think that they're just two different.
So I'd look at a couple areas. One, I think Greg touched on a little bit, is when he mentioned psychological, I'd say anxiety, arousal curves are always going to be a big thing when you can perform well in practice, but not in a competition. If in a practice type scenario, when the lights aren't on and the crowds aren't in the stands and you don't have somebody next to you, and some people perform better like that because it puts you in the sweet spot of anxiety and arousal. And then when you go to actually compete, anxiety is maybe too high, or arousal is maybe even too high, and you don't hit in the sweet spot of performance. So you actually do worse, even though you care more, or you're trying more, or you're thinking you're amped up. You're essentially too amped up. The other thing I would kind of look at would be how they practice. So for example, if I've had some athletes who like to treat training as a competition every day and basically test every single day in some fashion. And effectively what you're doing there is giving yourself an opportunity to make competitions, a true competition environment, less important. So if say you're a weightlifter and you allow yourself to miss 10 times at a maximal weight, that could never happen in a competition, but maybe you misguidedly think that your one made lift in the snatch, say, was justification for your 9 prior misses, and you go home patting yourself on the back thinking that you had a great day because you hit a PR lift even though you missed 9 times before. Well, in a competition, you could never do that. Competition, you have to do it on the day in your 3 attempts. Same thing in long jump or shot put or high jump. If you're a multi-eventer, you just get 3 attempts to get it right. So if you're not getting it right, then when you need to get it right, then it doesn't matter. So how you practice is very important. Putting some pressure on yourself, creating mock competitions, maybe even practicing with various unpredictable scenarios where you're introducing some contextual interference or movement variability or environmental variability, whether it's practicing in poor environments or adding more or less light or contrived circumstances and scenarios on yourself to make you put yourself in the mindset that you're might encounter in a competition. And then I guess the last thing that kind of comes to mind, specifically to the things that you addressed, were you said you're good at stand throws and good at acceleration and good at short approach jumps. All those things are very highly correlated with full event performance, but they're at the end of the day not the same thing. So something is probably missing in there, and a lot of times you're missing the progressions of basically moving from slow to fast. So maybe you rush that process in short approach long jumps or standing throws, you are fine. But when you go to do a full throw, you glide or you do a spin or whatever, maybe you rush out of the back. You're fast out of the back and then slow in the front of the circle. Or reverse on a full approach, you do the opposite of what you would want to do, where you, instead of big complete pushes and building tempo over the first couple steps of the run, that you are actually rushing your turnover and really speeding things up, so that when we get to the board, we're somewhat momentum deprived, as Boo would call it, and we're actually slowing down coming into the point when we want to be speeding up or at our fastest. We see that in Olympic weightlifting, guys that rush pulling off the ground really fast, or acceleration, they spin their wheels early and then they fizz out later on in the race, or jumping events where you're just too fast out of the back and then slow when it counts to take off. Throwing events, it's a major issue to be fast in the back of the circle and then slow when it counts in the front. And really, you have to get yourself in the mindset of being progressive in practically everything and not rushing the process. So slow to fast. It's a hard sell for a lot of people when they think that they need to throw really fast or jump really far or run really fast. But the best way to do it is oftentimes to slow things down in the first couple steps or first actions.
Yeah, going off of that, when you look at the sprint specific runs or the tests that you're doing, just like Mike was saying, slow to fast, when you're going over that 30 meters that you're testing, again, you may be really fast through that 30, but the other 70 matters when you're in the race. So that 30 for him might be more important for him to be a little more patient and have, like I said, a little more patient 30, whereas he can still accelerate for longer and longer, take the acceleration out past 30 meters, and eventually have your top speed be later in the race so that you end up decelerating less. So that's something to look at in terms of test specific, the sprint specific.
Yeah, I think with the long jump example is kind of what came to mind, that when you're doing short approach jumps and that slow to fast, short approach jumps, depending on how many steps, I would doubt that the athlete is going to be at the same speed on, say, an 8-step approach as opposed to a full step approach. And I think that changes a lot of the variables. You're no longer hitting the board at 11 meters per second or 10.5 meters per second. Maybe now you're at 8.5. So your foot's going to be on the ground longer. It's going to take longer for your center of mass to travel forward over the takeoff leg. And I think that time on the ground is going to change the stress shortening cycle. It's going to change how you amortize ultimately, your ability to apply force over that time interval. I think that all those variables are going to change. And so once again, it's not the same thing. So yeah, it does correlate. It is still long jump. It still is a short approach. But I mean, there are people who sometimes can move their approach a couple steps forward and will jump actually further. At the elite level, I haven't seen that too much, but especially progressing kids up. And I think a lot of that just has to do with how well you produce force over different periods of time. But that's just an example specific to long jump that I kind of thought about.
Yeah, so as a group here, if we're thinking about specific training tools we might be able to give them, even just tips here and there, what might we be able to recommend for someone like this that's just having trouble, other than just looking at what they're already doing? What else might they be able to add in or modify?
So I look at the practice design. If you're doing fully block practice, where you just do dozens and dozens of the repetitions using the exact same technical constraints repeatedly, I would move away from that, start introducing some serial practice and randomized practice. And introducing movement variability, contextual interference, just to challenge the motor program and your skill acquisition a little bit. That way, when you get into the chaotic world of competition, that you're a little bit more prepared for it, and your technical abilities will hold up better under the pressure of competition and under new scenarios that are inevitably encountered in competitive situations, that you'll have better transfer from the skills that you practiced in training to the actual competition. I'd look at getting some exposure to the actual competition events outside of the actual competition. So you should probably see full approach long jumps and full approach or full throws in practice, maybe in a mock competition environment where you put some pressure on yourself. You say, hey, I'll take a maximum of 10 throws today. But if I don't have a throw over 40 meters in my first 3, then I'm gonna shut it down. So you put some pressure on yourself to be able to achieve early, or you have a constrained practice environment, similar to what you might see in the competitive arena. And then I think from a physical side of things, I think maybe some stuff that both John and Greg alluded to was there could be some physical things going on there as well. Obviously, if you're better at these things that are much more low-end power related, weightlifting movements, acceleration, standing throws, short approach, long jumps, and not as good in the competitive arena when things become much more elastic, eccentric, and bouncy, that maybe that's what you lack. Maybe it's not your brain or your mind or your practice scenario. Maybe you're just not, don't have great eccentric force generating capacities. And that could be something for sure. I mean, without knowing all your test numbers, if your fly 10 is poor, or if your jump performances are poor, maybe reactive strength index, that kind of thing, if that's low, maybe that's a place to look and say, okay, it's really just a physical thing. Upstairs you're okay, but physically you don't quite have it. There's plenty of stories out there of guys that can squat the house, and they can go out and they can beat sprinters or jumpers or football guys or whatever at 10 meters or 15 yards or whatever it is. But then you ask them to run longer than that, and they're garbage. And that could very well be what you're seeing. We've got guys who can throw really well from a stand. I've seen this as the Chapo biomechanist. They throw really well from a stand, but they don't pick up very much at all from the full throw. And ultimately, who cares if you can throw well from a stand, because in most cases that's not going to be enough to win. So we need to be good at the thing that counts. So whether it's physical or mental, you got to have some exposure to that specific competitive activity in similar constraints, whether it is the practice strategy that you choose or the doing full attempts, full throws, full jumps, that kind of thing every now and then. It doesn't take a lot. Alternatively, you could just basically enter into competitions and just say, I don't give a shit about the competition, I'm just going to use this as practice. And that works really well. I think sometimes that's enough of a mental break to reduce anxiety and put you in that anxiety arousal sweet spot where you can perform really well in a competitive environment, just by saying, hey, I don't care as much about this. This is essentially just a practice. You do see a lot of people perform really well like that when their season is effectively done, the championship has occurred, and then they go and enter a couple meets after the fact, just some local meets, and they PR. They get a lifetime PR, and it has nothing to do with their physical qualities getting better. It's everything to do with the fact that they just allowed themselves to perform at a high level because the stress was too high before. So whatever the case is, you got to find a way to replicate not just the movement patterns, I think, of your competitive event, but the competitive environment as well, whether that's making a full approach or making it competitive environment where there's pressure, or introducing chaotic scenarios where you're can't predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, and just to touch on one thing that he mentioned there, the eccentric force generating capacity is a big thing when we're talking about high speeds. So whether it's the latter half of the 100-meter sprint where you're in basically your max velocity mechanics, or the end of your full approach long jump, the faster you're running, the quicker your contacts are, the more eccentric force generating capacity you're going to need to continue that. So that's one thing on a physical side to potentially think about putting a little more effort into if that's something that's lacking. And the RSI, Reactive Strength Index testing protocol, a couple different methods for it, but that's something that can pretty simply give you an idea. And I think someone who's competing at a high level and performing at a high level in track and field should have quite good numbers on the RSI value. So one thing, easy to check, pretty simple, and can give you an idea of if that's an issue, if it's something that could be improved upon.